there's a secret war going on. One that dates back all the way to the end of the Second World War. It's not a war with guns and armed forces, but a war on the monetary system. Wait, I know what you're thinking.
This is what? This is boring.
But this affects every one of us lives. Yet, almost no one knows about it. Toward the end of World War II, countries sought to establish an international financial system that fostered cooperation and growth among countries. In 1944, they held what was known as the Bretton Woods Conference. There were two options. The first was called BANCOR, created by this guy. BANCOR was not a currency, but a unit of account to track flows of assets and liabilities on all international trade. It was backed by a basket of different commodities and designed to be a neutral reserve asset used to settle trade between nations. It was not dependent on any individual country and was thus less prone to crisis. If you were a creditor nation, you sold more than you bought. You ended up with a surplus in BANCOR. If you were a debtor nation, you bought more than you sold. You ended up with a deficit. In practice, the latter would mean you would sell your own currency, buy BANCOR, and your currency would weaken against creditor nations. It was a self-regulating system. The second option was the US option. The dollar would be the reserve currency. It would be pegged to gold at $35 an ounce, which meant if you had $35, you could swap it in for an ounce of gold. The US was at the time the only major economy that hadn't been ravaged by two back-to-back world wars. They had a large trade surplus, they had gold reserves, and they were guaranteeing free world trade. In short, the US convinced the rest of the world to go with the US option. The new monetary system started off great, maybe a little too great. The downtrodden economies in Europe and Japan quickly got back on their feet, and the US gold started draining fast. At the end of World War II, the US had over 21,000 tons of gold. By 1971, the US was down to only 8,000 tons. And this was worrying the US. They would soon run out of gold unless they aggressively devalued the dollar by making each ounce of gold more expensive. And that would be catastrophic, since that meant the dollar would be worth a lot less. And after 27 great years, Nixon ended the Bretton Woods system in 1971, and the US dollar was no longer pegged against gold.
I have directed Secretary Connally to suspend temporarily the convertibility of the dollar into gold or other reserve assets.
But this also diminished the US influence in the world. Without gold, the dollar really had no appeal as a reserve currency, and they needed to act quickly. This was when the US turned to oil. The oil market was big enough to serve as a kind of pseudo-reserve asset. The Americans met with the Saudis and convinced them to only take dollars for their oil, and to influence the rest of OPEC, the other major oil-producing powers in the world, to do the same. And the petrodollar was born. The result of this was that every country in the world was by proxy backing the dollar. They needed to sell their own currency and buy dollars to buy oil. Up until 2005, things were going great. During these 30 years, oil was mostly trading between $15 and $30 per barrel. This meant if you bought a US Treasury bond that would pay you in 10-15 years, you were pretty comfortable knowing that your dollars would buy a pretty consistent amount of oil. And then things just stopped being great. A lot of things were happening simultaneously. Emerging markets were rapidly growing, and China was on the cusp of becoming a global superpower. Basically, all these new countries needed a rapidly increasing amount of oil. This while the world's great oil fields were reaching peak levels and depleting fast. And at the absolutely worst time imaginable, the subprime crisis happened. Now the Federal Reserve had two choices: sacrifice the domestic economy by hiking rates to get oil back into that 30-year sweet spot of $15 to $30 per barrel, or save the domestic economy by lowering rates to prevent domestic banks from blowing up. Being the reserve currency of the world wasn't just fun and games, it also led to a lot of tough calls. In the 70s, the US was being ravaged by massive inflation, which reached almost 15%. In 1979, the Federal Reserve Chairman Paul Volcker attended an International Monetary Fund conference in Yugoslavia, where he was met by Germany, France, and a bunch of other European leaders, demanding that he do something about the US inflation. Since all of these countries were tied to the dollar, they were also affected by the diminishing value of the currency. And this put Volcker in a tough spot: save the US economy or save the US dollar as the world's reserve currency. Volcker chose the latter and basically blew up the US economy by taking interest rates to 15%, putting the US into severe austerity and their country into a severe recession to stop inflation. Because Volcker didn't only manage the dollar for America, but for the entire world. And this is what basically every country, from China to Europe, expected would happen in 2008. But it didn't. This time, the US said, this ain't our problem, and started printing insane amounts of money, trillions of dollars, to buy treasury bonds and prop up their own economy. And oil shot up. It went to $50, $60, $70, all the way to $150 a barrel by the summer of 2008. The dollar was in an absolute free fall against oil. This action shocked a lot of countries, and they realized they could no longer count on the US to act in their best interest. After this, China laid out a suggestion to the Bank of International Settlements, an institution owned by central banks for financial cooperation, that there needs to be a reform of the international currency system because the US was not doing its job. To China and basically every other country, this was not just a money issue, it was a national security issue. If you're a country that needs to import energy, who needs to import oil, you need to hold massive quantities of dollars to buy this oil. And if you run out of oil or dollars, your currency and economy will crash. And if you're an oil exporter, you're pricing your oil in dollars, you have no sovereignty. You're a subsidiary of the US Fed, and your oil price will be affected by the US economy, financial policy, and fiscal policy. The US showed that they no longer cared about the value of the dollar by just printing an insane amount of new money, which caused the value of the dollar to shrink. China knew that its dollar reserves would dwindle in value fast. They needed an increasing amount of oil to grow their economy, but if they bought dollars and America kept spending, well, it wouldn't end well. While they previously had no other choice, they now did. They no longer wanted to be tied to the dollar. In 2014, China and Russia started working together, signing big oil and gas deals circumventing the US dollar. China even allowed Russia to settle their oil and gas trades in yuan and then exchange it for gold. And China was not the only country that realized they need to be able to buy oil with their own currency or be beholden to the US domestic spending habits. When the euro was introduced in 1999, 15% of euro reserves went into gold, which acted as a ballast. With this semi-peg, investors knew that the euro would always be good for gold, and they couldn't print unlimited quantities of money unless they wanted massive devaluation. By 2010, European countries, Russia and China were buying massive amounts of gold, and by 2018 they started unloading US treasuries. They were moving away from the dollar as a reserve asset and towards a banker type system proposed 80 years ago. Despite the circumstances, in 2008 the US balance sheet was in pretty decent shape. The debt was only 60% of GDP. 10 years later, it was an entirely different story. Debt to GDP was now at 130%. The US balance sheet was a dumpster fire, and the fiscal situation was extremely weak. Fast forward to 2022. Putin knows the US is in an incredibly weak spot, that without him and his energy, the rest of the world would be forced into a recession. This would put the US at the brink of yet another financial crisis and would force the Federal Reserve to print even more money to meet US payments and liabilities. The US knows they are weak, and they now need a way to get out of the dollar system. Why? Wasn't the dollar system good for the US? Well, yes and no. When other countries need to buy the dollar to buy energy, it artificially strengthens the dollar and artificially weakens other currencies. This makes it much more attractive to manufacture in other countries and then sell it back to the US. They've basically been incentivizing the deindustrialization of their own country. This is great for US GDP growth in the short and medium term, but long term, they go bankrupt. Over the last decades, the US has basically outsourced all their production and manufacturing to China. And now they're at a point that if China pulls their exports, the US goes under. The dollar system was a national security risk for Europe, China, Russia, and the Saudis for decades. But now it has become a potential national security risk for the US as well. What would happen if China sides with Russia? The US can't cut China off, or they will hyperinflate their own economy. They would risk losing the Saudis and their energy as well. China is now their biggest customer. There's a reason the US has been flying down to Iran and Venezuela, panhandling for oil, countries that they've systematically effed over for the past 20-40 years. The US is a victim of its own success, and they are in a really weak position with Russia weaponizing oil against them. The US wants systematic change. They need to get off the dollar system to be able to build a robust economy and reshore manufacturing for national security. security reasons. But it's not so easy to change the international monetary systems. This kind of disruption comes with all kinds of unwanted consequences, like higher inflation, and it makes the US look incredibly weak. So, what would make them look strong? To hit Russia where it hurts. The US, together with the EU, sanctioned Russian central banks and basically said that Russia's foreign reserve currency is no longer good as money. Basically, what the US is saying is, take your money elsewhere. And this is not only to Russia, but all other central banks in the world. A precedent has been set. Central banks don't want to have their foreign reserves frozen, and they don't know if they're at risk of being labeled a bad actor in the future. Look at the past 80 years. Most countries in the world has at one time or another been labeled bad actors by the US, including several Western European countries. Then, it wasn't in the US interest to cut them off, but now it is. Looking back on this, we will most likely see that this is every bit as big as when Nixon closed the gold window in '71. It's now in everyone's interest that the dollar system ends and to transition into a new system. It's a system that has reached the end of its useful life. But this is far from over and the ramifications are still unknown. Putin isn't taking Western sanctions lightly and is imposing counter-sanctions on energy to hit us where it hurts. How will this war evolve? To understand that, you need to watch this next video.